I tell people I began life as an attorney. I wasn't born a baby attorney, but I started my work life as an attorney. I did divorce and custody for victims of domestic violence. And then I did that for several years. And then I went and worked in Washington, D.C. and did advocacy for legal services attorneys. So attorneys like I was an attorney as something called legal services attorney. And they're the folks who help people who do not have the financial ability to get legal services. And there is something called the Legal Services Corporation, which is like a quasi-governmental agency. And so I moved to DC and worked for the National Legal Aid and Defender Association and supported legal services attorneys with funding, training, that kind of thing. And then I moved to New York and I ran a foundation for several years, and we did grant making related to legal services infrastructure. So all told, I spent about a decade either practicing law, advocating with law, or funding legal related things. And then I tell people I joined the circus and I became a journalist, and I spent a decade as a news anchor around the country as a journalist doing the news. And then I left the news and became a nonprofit executive, consultant, and adjunct professor. So yeah, I've done a lot of things. That the future is diverse. So how are you going to win the future? And what I really want folks to understand is that this is no different than, say, a company expanding to another country, right? When you expand to another country, you have to consider language, culture, access, inclusion, diversity, equitable pay. You have to consider all those things. And so let's look at the modern workforce as a miniature of international expansion, right? So in your workforce, you have all of this representation. And how do you do that where you are expanding your market, you are expanding your expertise, and ultimately, it's how you're going to win the future. You know, I tell people, do you want to be Blockbuster or do you want to be Netflix? Or do you want to be what's after Netflix, right? And that requires creative thinking, a diversity of people to give you that insight. So winning the future is not a retreat from the reality of a diverse world and a diverse workforce. It's leaning into that. So that is really designed to help businesses understand this from that perspective and give them the tools and intellectually help them kind of build the bridge to understand why this is, important of winning the future. So people want to know, what is competency checking? How does it show up in my workplace? And how can I interrupt it? And how can I change it? So this is really tied to the book. And that keynote really helps hone in on the ways in which the pipeline is blocked and it's not broken. So it's that kind of thing, and showing you, and I may have one on the pipeline being blocked and not broken, but the competency checking really hones in specifically on what are the elements of competency checking, how are they showing up in your workplace in ways you may not be aware of, how do you disrupt it, and how can you change it? Through my consulting work, what I was hearing over and over from leaders of color is that they were meeting so much resistance. They were meeting resistance. They would get these jobs, everything's resistance, and then they're a witch, or I tell people they're a witch in the fairy tale sense, not in the Wiccan sense, and they're not. And so what I wanted to do was create a session that both speaks to the issues that leaders of color, excuse me, I'm recovering from bronchitis, that leaders of color find themselves meeting, and also highlighting for companies the ways in which they may be unaware that they are hampering both the development and the success of leaders of color. And I talk about this as like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, or Through the Looking Glass. Leaders of color find themselves in positions that are so strange and so peculiar as to almost be unbelievable. I mean, some of the things that people have told me. And so I really want to both recognize and support the experience that leaders of color are having, but also provide actionable solutions for their companies as to what does it really mean to onboard a leader of color, especially in a team that has never had a leader of color, may never have had a woman, in a workplace that is really rooted in kind of the great man theory of leadership, which is generally white male leadership. How do you prepare a team and that leader to succeed? Colorblinded is really trying to get at the idea that, hey, if we just have a colorblind society, everything's going to be okay. And what data tells us is that colorblind solutions end up favoring white people. They actually do not promote a more fair and equitable society. And that has to do with the fact that our society is not equitable. We don't live in a race neutral society. And the example I give in the book, and an example I give in other places too, so is the World War II GI Bill. So the World War II GI Bill had a housing benefit, and the World War II GI Bill was race neutral. It didn't say you had to be black or white to get the benefits. You didn't have to be white, but 1.2 million Black folks served in World War II, and a scant percent, I mean, it might be 0.02% or some ridiculously small number, were ever able to get the GI housing loan. And the reason was because the system in which they lived was not race neutral, right? At that time, there was Jim Crow, and then, there was a big racial disparity. So what we know from that example is that you can put race neutrality in, but when you put it in a system that still has race-based assumptions, it doesn't work. And not only does it not work, it inures to the benefit of the majority and continues disparities. So really kind of exploding the myth that a colorblind system, because there's a quote, and I forget the author, but color blindness just makes us blind to the impact of racism. It doesn't change racism. The myth of qualifications is pernicious in our society. So the myth of qualifications is really designed to help us rethink these long list of qualifications we have for hiring positions. Are they even relevant? Why do we think we have to have them? And so there is some historical contextual work that happens in that, where we talk about the fact that the qualifications start to shift in the United States depending on who's seeking entry. Okay, so this is common knowledge, but the college admissions test, the SAT, comes out of something called the military intelligence test. And the military intelligence test was designed to prove that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were smarter than Jewish people. Like, literally, that's not made up. That's it. The military intelligence test, one of its main features, was designed to do that. The SAT is based on that. So we start using aptitude tests in college admissions once Jewish people start seeking more entry into elite universities. So it's a case of the out group trying to enter and the in group setting up barriers. So when we think about qualifications, we think they're neutral, they're meritorious, but most of the qualifications we have established come from our attempts to keep outsiders out and keep benefit from insiders. Well, one thing I do want to say too, and just for folks to know, I really practice a non-shaming type of training and keynoting. And so while the topics may be heavy, it is important for me to build intellectual bridges that everybody can walk across to understand the content. So, my sessions are not designed to, shame people or anything like that, but really to enlighten and connect the dots.